Loyola University Maryland's campuses are located on ancestral grounds, originally cared for and inhabited by indigenous communities for thousands of years. The racist violence of settler colonialism, past and present, led to the traumatization and destruction of millions of indigenous bodies, communities, cultures, and resources. We must acknowledge that we live on and benefit from this land that was taken by force. As a Jesuit Catholic institution, we are called by our values to engage in active discernment about the role that our institution and the Catholic Church have to play in the oppression, exclusion, and erasure of indigenous nations. Loyola University Maryland commits to calling out continued systemic injustices, repairing institutional harms, and renewing our commitment to working in solidarity to heal this land. The Center for Humanities has sponsored this series since 1986, in which students read a common text and engage in discussions across disciplines. We develop programming around a central theme of the text, which culminates in the keynote address. This year, we are honored to host world-renowned author Amitav Ghosh to speak about climate migration and his important and prescient book, The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. I'll keep my comments brief to make room for an engaging talk and a Q&A session at the end. However, it is important to thank those who have worked to make the symposium possible. The Center for Humanities hosted many programs and events to give students and faculty experiential engagement with the climate emergency from a local perspective here in Baltimore. In the fall, artist Stacy Levy visited our campus, meeting with faculty, staff, and students to learn about our community and our environmental concerns. Stacy then created a proposal for a public art project to be installed on campus that directly intervenes with the natural landscape. Her concept is to create a spiral of native plants to allow members of the community to walk through this pathway and reflect on their connections with the natural world. The site that she has chosen is near the volleyball court next to Dorothy Day and the gardens. The plants will encircle the storm drain, which leads directly to nearby Stony Run. The project highlights our connections with the river. The native plants will directly improve the drainage by creating a buffer. Stacy Levy will be installing this project next week on Wednesday the 19th and Thursday the 20th, and you all are invited to come out, touch the earth, get your hands dirty, and help plant these native trees and shrubs. Please scan the QR code to register for a specific time. If you're not a Loyola student or employee, you can email me, Billy Friebel or Bess Garrett, and you can find our email addresses at the bottom of the image, which I'll go back to now. Hopefully nobody's scanning at the moment, but I see a couple. I'll wait a second. So I'll go back to that and keep speaking. Speaking of Bess Garrett, she is indeed the most important person to thank for her expertise and support of all aspects of this symposium. I couldn't have done this without her, and I really appreciate her support. Julio Fine Arts Gallery Director Megan Rook-Hepsel was instrumental in facilitating Stacy Levy's public art project, and I'm grateful for her collaborative energy in organizing this project from the beginning through its completion next week. Another important piece of programming occurred 3 weeks ago when we co-hosted a toxic tour of Curtis Bay with the Center for Community Service and Justice, and a follow-up roundtable event to reflect on all the injustices we witnessed in South Baltimore. I want to thank Steve Park for his partnership in inviting Nicole Fabricant to lead us through these two events. This was a powerful example of what the liberal arts can do, bringing diverse disciplines together to understand the complexities of the environmental justice issues happening in our city of Baltimore, connecting with the Humanities Symposium theme, the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor. The wonderful poster for this event was created by visual art, communications and media student Catherine Albert. I want to thank Noelle Teixeira for inviting us into her graphics classes and for integrating the poster design into the curriculum. There were many amazing designs and we had such a hard time choosing the winner. Thank you to Louis Umerlich and Eden Bartlett in Marketing and Communications for assisting with this process from the beginning and facilitating the poster design through its many manifestations. Finally, thank you to the text selection committee, Marion Crowdy, Nick Miller, Jill Snodgrass, and Andrea Thomas. who read many excellent books and collectively decided that The Great Derangement was a perfect text for our interdisciplinary conversations about the topic that is central to our mission at Loyola. When I first encountered the work of Amitav Ghosh, I heard an interview that he did with Emergence magazine while driving to work. I was so spellbound by his ideas that I continuously pressed rewind so that I could digest the concepts that he was elucidating. It felt as if he was pulling back a veil to reveal the inner workings of our global networks and the consequences of our histories. Reading The Great Derangement only extended this awakening. It is a book that has changed my own research trajectory and the way that I live my life. In reflecting on the role that fiction must play in responding to the climate crisis, Mr. Ghosh unearths key questions about the barriers that each discipline experiences in addressing the most important issues of our time. Amitav Ghosh was born in Calcutta and grew up in India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. He studied in Delhi, Oxford, and Alexandria. His work has been translated into more than 30 languages, and he has served on the juries of the Loyola and Venice Film Festivals. The Great Derangement, Climate Changing the Unthinkable, a work of nonfiction, was given the inaugural Utah Award for the Environmental Humanities in 2018. His essays have appeared in The New Yorker, The New Republic, and The New York Times. Amitav Ghosh holds 4 Lifetime Achievement Awards and 5 honorary doctorates. In 2007, he was awarded the Padma Shri, one of India's highest honors, by the President of India. In 2010, he was a joint winner, along with Margaret Atwood, of a Dan David Prize. And in 2011, he was awarded the Grand Prix of the Blue Metropolis Festival in Montreal. In 2018, the Gandhi Award, India's highest literary honor, was conferred on Amitav Ghosh. He was the first English language writer to receive the award. In 2019, Foreign Policy magazine named him one of the most important global thinkers of the preceding decade. In 2024, he was awarded the Erasmus Prize by the Premium Erasmium Award Foundation. Please join me in warmly welcoming Amitav Ghosh to the stage.
Thank you all very much for being here. And I'd especially like to thank Lily Frivilli of the Center for Humanities for inviting me and for selecting my book to be read across so many departments and disciplines. It's really such a privilege to know that students who are studying so many different things have responded to the book in their own ways. That the book has really resonated with them. So it's just a great thrill for me to be here. So I'm going to talk about migration and displacement in this in an age of planetary crisis. But before I begin, I'd just like to say migration is a very multifaceted phenomenon. It's a very complicated and multifaceted phenomenon. It's impossible for anyone to sum up every aspect of it. And I do want to remind you here that I'm not talking about the situation on the borders of America, because I haven't done any research there. I haven't really been there. And the reason for that is that I told myself I didn't know the languages that are spoken there. I don't speak Spanish or Portuguese. But of course now, the second largest group of migrants is from South Asia, so I do know some of the languages that are spoken on the border, both borders, Canada and I think what I'm going to say here really applies to many of those South Asian migrants on the U.S. borders as well. But my interest in migrants began a very long time ago. My own family was displaced from Bangladesh actually by a climate event in the mid-19th century. And since then, my relatives, we've all been sort of traveling forever. But since so much of my work is about migration and displaced people, it's not surprising that the so-called European migration crisis of basically 2014-2016 caught my attention. Like millions of other people, so these are some of my books, all of them are about migrants and migration. This one is about Burma, where there was a very large number of Indian indentured workers. So I was riveted by these media reports about the refugees who were then making their way to Europe by the Mediterranean and the Balkans. And at a certain point, as I followed the coverage, I noticed something that I couldn't quite make sense of. The European media were more or less unanimous in claiming that the refugees were from war-torn or economically devastated countries in Africa and the Middle East, Eritrea, Somalia, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. But when I looked closely at photographs and television footage, I saw many faces, as many of us will recognize, I saw many faces that were unmistakably from the Indian subcontinent. Indeed, a large number seem to be from the part of the world where my own origins lie, which is Bengal. So, on looking deeper into the matter, I learned from official UN statistics that Bangladesh was near the top of the list of the countries of origin of the migrants and refugees. This was completely at odds with the media narrative about refugees fleeing from war-torn and economically devastated countries. There are, of course, many simmering political conflicts in Bangladesh, as indeed there are in every South Asian country. But the level of violence in Bangladesh, as indeed there in Bangladesh, does not even begin to approach that of, say, Syria or Afghanistan or Eritrea. Nor can it be said that Bangladesh's economy is in dire straits. The country has actually been one of the top performers globally for the last few years. Its growth rate surpassed India's in 2018. It is a fact also that according to some social indicators, Bangladesh has done better than India. Average life expectancy in the country is now 72 years as opposed to 68 years in India and 66 in Pakistan. Indeed, Bangladesh's performance has been so impressive that a leading economist recently commented that the country is on a path that would have been unimaginable just 2 decades ago towards becoming an Asian success story. So having just published The Great Derangement, A Climate Change and the Unthinkable, it was perhaps inevitable that I should begin to wonder whether the exodus from the Indian subcontinent was somehow related to climate change. The fact that many of the migrants were from Bangladesh seemed to support this idea. As is well known, the Bengal Delta is extremely vulnerable to climate change, and it's projected that tens of millions of Bangladeshis will be displaced by climate change in the coming decades. Given all of this, it seemed natural to assume that climate change was somehow invisibly pushing people out of Bangladesh. Why else would so many young men, and the migrants were overwhelmingly male and young, be undertaking dangerous journeys across West Asia and North Africa to Europe? Now, such answers as I was able to find in the media tended to be formulaic. It was often said, for instance, that the migrants had set off in search of a better life. To me, this seemed to beg many questions. For instance, what is a good life? How is that life imagined? What are the images and promises that give shape to the idea of a better life? On examination, it turned out that the phrase better life was just another meaningless marketing slogan. So, media reports rarely probe into the motivations of migrants in any depth. And I personally believe that the reason for this is that it's because those journalists who write about migration are overwhelmingly Western, and their interests tend to be focused on matters of policy, public welfare, and so on. Moreover, and most crucially, very few of these journalists speak the languages of the migrants. So it struck me that, since I do, because of the circumstances of my birth and education, I happen to speak 3 of the languages that are widely spoken among migrant communities: Bengali, Hindi, Urdu, and Egyptian Arabic. So I thought I might have a different perspective on this. And in 2017, I decided to spend some time in Italy to see what I could learn from the migrants themselves. So I did this long tour through Italy, visiting all their migrant centers and so on. And they call them welcome. They have these welcome centers, centri di accoglienza. So it was really instructive to actually speak to the migrants themselves because, the problem is that when migrants speak about their experiences and their motivations in, let's say, Italian or English, they basically know what to say. So they present a certain kind of story. And when you speak to them in their own languages, the stories that they present are actually radically different. So the first thing to be aware of, it seems to me, is that it becomes almost tempting to speak of climate migrants and climate migration. And this is a phenomenon that's widely discussed and people talk about it very widely. But it's very important to recognize that to highlight anthropogenic climate change as the principal driver of migration, to me, is a kind of climate reductionism. It reduces a very complex phenomenon to a single dynamic. And this became apparent to me in the course of my conversations with Bengali migrants in Italy. The people I spoke to insisted, almost without exception, that environmental changes were only one of many factors that shaped their decision to leave. Of other factors that were cited, most often there were land disputes, family difficulties, religious conflicts, and political problems. And also, this was something that really surprised me, though it shouldn't have. But issues of honor. Often they felt dishonored at home and they were just set off on these journeys. So, as I listened to the migrant stories, it became obvious that the more easily identifiable factors sometimes obscured certain motivating forces that were also formative, yet very difficult to identify. One such is the power of example, or the desire to emulate friends, neighbors, and relatives who had already made the journey. This is perhaps particularly important in relation to Bangladesh, which has a long history of sending young men overseas. Maritime trade was a critical vector in this. For centuries, Bengali men supplied much of the labor for sail ships and steamers. Some of these sailors, or lascars as they were called, settled in Britain and other countries, including the United States. There's actually a very interesting book called Bengali Harlem about people who jumped ship and stayed on in Harlem. And so, because of the money they sent home, these migrants came to be greatly admired in their villages. In other words, successful migrants became, as it were, objects of mimesis in every stratum of society. Now, mimesis has always played a very important part in the movements of people. This is something that all of you will be familiar with. In the 19th century, for instance, many migratory journeys from Europe, especially Italy and Ireland, to Australia and the Americas, were prompted by the example of friends and relatives. But today, we are in an age in which the mimetic urge has become a goldmine for new, very powerful technologies. The social media, for example, are programmed precisely on mimetic principles. As Jeff Schellenberger has pointed out, in a very illuminating account of the genesis of Facebook, I'll quote from his, social media platforms perpetually enjoin users through various means to enter the iterative chain of mimesis. Now, it's worth recalling that the seed money for Facebook came from Peter Thiel, who's a disciple of the leading contemporary theorist of mimesis, René Girard. Indeed, Thiel credits Girard's theories with having inspired his interest in this technology. And it's very important to note that Peter Thiel was the mentor and patron of our current vice president. So in exploiting the mimetic urge, the social media have given new strength and urgency to the desires that it generates. Moreover, such is the reach of the social media that they have ensured that no one, anywhere, is excluded from these desires. Even in the remotest corners of the world, the social media are now accessible to anyone who has the means to buy a device that is available in many inexpensive iterations. The smartphone, which provides even the illiterate a means of accessing the internet through voice recognition technology, is absolutely ubiquitous. In India, for example, there are twice as many cell phones as there are people. I think this is something Westerners don't understand actually, that the reach of the internet and especially the social media is actually much greater in, let's say, South Asia, East Africa, than it is here. Cell phones have also hugely accelerated the circulation of images, thereby greatly expanding the reach of the advertising industry, which is expressly dedicated to the production of mimetic desire. This in turn has brought about a homogenization of desire on a scale never before seen, extending across the planet and into the deepest reaches of the human soul. Today, with very few exceptions, people everywhere, on every continent, nurture the same desires, most of which are centered on commodities. This cannot but have profound consequences. Let us imagine, for example, a boy in a Bengal village who spends most of his day working in his father's rice fields. The conditions are difficult because he has to be on his feet through the day under a burning sun, often standing in ankle-deep mud. Changing weather patterns are making things still worse because daytime temperatures now sometimes go up almost to 50 degrees and the rains increasingly don't come on time. The boy's family does, however, happen to possess a cell phone, which they charge with a solar panel. Through WhatsApp, they're linked to a couple of relatives who have already sold up and left. On the screen of their phone, they see advertisements for fine clothes, refrigerators, and other goods. They also see pictures of their relatives taken on the streets of prosperous European cities. Now, does the boy's uprooting begin with climate events? Or does it begin with the images that he sees on that tiny screen? And is it a coincidence that climate events and consumer culture have begun to impact his life at the same time? Or are they perhaps both symptoms of the same thing, an ever-increasing acceleration of economy and technology, production and consumption? Now, the transformative power of devices like computers and smartphones have long been recognized. Such devices are not merely tools that humans use to achieve certain ends. To use them is inevitably to interact with them, and the process is known to bring about certain neurological changes in human mind bodies, especially among the young and impressionable. All of this is well known. Yet when the effects of virtual reality on human consciousness are discussed, it is almost always in relation to affluent and semi-affluent countries. The very subject conjures up images of Palo Alto, Shanghai, and Osaka, and of unsociable teenagers skulking in rooms that are filled with expensive gear. In my view, this picture is deeply misleading. The digital revolution has broken the long-standing links between affluence, education, and technical ability. In India and in many other poor countries, there are large numbers of people whose virtual abilities are completely disproportionate to their formal education and material circumstances. Even in remote villages, young people are exposed to digital technologies quite early, and many become adept at using the internet. Although they may not be immersed in the virtual world in the way of a teenager in, say, Palo Alto or Osaka, the impact on them may be just as great or even greater, precisely because of the vast difference between their lived reality and what they see on the screen. This in turn raises another question. What is the nature of the migrant's agency in these circumstances? Take the case of the boy in the Bengal village. Is his decision to migrate wholly his own, or is it to some degree the product of his interactions with the cognitive assemblage that manifests itself in his handheld device? If that is the case, then to what degree are young migrants responsible for their decision to move? Today, there is a widespread awareness of the ethical and philosophical dilemmas that arise when humans interact with self-guided machines. For example, autonomous weapons like killer drones. If we are willing to accept that the same dilemmas may arise also at the other end of the human and technological spectrum, that is, in relation to poor people in the global south, It's perhaps because we are unable to acknowledge the true scale of the disruptions that have been set in motion by the technologies of our time. And I've been talking about The Boy from the Bengal Village, but very recently I went to see a movie, a documentary made in the Niyamgiri Hills, which is one of the remotest parts of Odisha. And this was filmed amongst an indigenous community who were very deeply tied to the soil for thousands and thousands of years. But these guys who made the movie said to me that now all the young people within these communities, because they have the cell phones, they don't want to work on the land anymore. They want to join the stream of migration either to the cities or overseas. So to return to that boy in a Bengal village, his predicament is not wholly imaginary. This is one such. Across Italy, I met many young Bengali migrants who had grown up in such villages. Many of them had come to Italy through Libya, where they had been subjected to beatings, abuse, and torture. They all spoke of being sold by labor contractors, of being deprived of food and water, of being denied wages, and of the constant threat of robbery by roadside gangs. These accounts are so saturated with stories of savagery that it's easy to think of these experiences as being somehow extrinsic to our own time of accelerated communication. They are taken to be symptoms of the growing gulf between the first and other worlds. Yet far from being throwbacks, these journeys are inseparable from contemporary technologies. Cell phones, for instance, are a pervasive presence on the migrants' persons and within their accounts of their journeys. Every link in the chain of movement depends on cell phones. It is through them that migrants receive money from home and make payments to the agents who arrange their journeys. Their mobile devices are the compasses that guide them on their long overland treks, and they also provide vital information about entry points, shelters, and assistance. When migrants confront danger, their first move is to reach for their phones to summon help. It is through them that they distract themselves from the rigors of the road, stay in constant touch with their cohorts, and chronicle their journeys for their friends and relatives. Similarly, cell phones and social media are indispensable also for the clandestine networks that arrange migrants' journeys. The internet makes every element of their business safer and more anonymous, beginning with recruiting and publicizing their services, and extending to procuring forged documents for the migrants. I quote, "The cell phone is an essential instrument for traffickers," notes a prominent Italian anti-mafia official. "They're not like other organized criminals who stay away from telephonic communications," unquote. No wonder then that cell phones have become iconic of the present wave of migration in the same way that bundles and battered suitcases were in earlier times. Far from expanding the distance between poor and rich countries, in certain very important respects, information technology has actually shrunk that gulf. Yet the presence of this technology is rarely identified, either by the narrator or the listener. And the reason for this is that the cell phone has become a part of our technological unconscious. In other words, these devices and technologies are now so deeply embedded in our unconscious cognitive processes that we take them for granted, in the same way that we do the presence of electricity or cars. Like all formative technologies, this one too has become invisible. But every now and then, a detail surfaces to remind us of this ubiquitous presence. Here, for example, is a story that I was told by a 20-something Bangladeshi migrant who had spent several years in Libya. I'll call him Polash. One day, when Polash and some others were walking back from a day's work on the outskirts of Tripoli, they were ambushed by a gang of Kalashnikov-carrying Libyans. The only thing of value that Polash had on him was his cell phone. He managed to kick it into the sand, praying that it would not ring or light up with a notification. When the gangsters asked him to hand over his valuables, he gave them his money and told them he had nothing else, not even a cell phone. The gangsters didn't believe him and made him strip naked, and then bent him over so that they could probe his rectal cavity with sticks to see if he had hidden something in there. Finding nothing, they beat him and stabbed him in the arm, but he still didn't tell them that the phone was lying in the sand. They left him lying by the road, bleeding profusely, and the first thing he did, even before binding his wounds or putting on his clothes, was to retrieve his cell phone. To him, it was almost as valuable as life itself. It might be asked, if the migrants are indeed adept at dealing with information technology, then why are they not able to acquire more realistic impressions of the current conditions in Europe? Why do they not understand that they will probably never find regular employment in Greece or Italy and might well have to eke out a living selling trinkets on the street while being preyed upon by gangs, predatory employers, and even the police? This is where the interactive aspect of the cyber world becomes crucial. It's widely acknowledged today that the information provided to us by the internet and social media is to a large extent shaped by our own desires, presuppositions, and networks. As a result, such information often has the effect of buttressing our prejudices and expectations, leading us to lend credence to fake news. I suspect that this is precisely what happened to many of the migrants I met. What they saw of Europe on the net was shaped by their own expectations and by feedbacks from their social networks. They ended up seeing what they wanted to see. In effect, they, like so many of us, are victims of wish fulfillment fantasies based on fake news. As an illustration, here's a story told by two Italian reporters by a Pakistani connection man based in Italy. So I quote. He says, "Every time I go home to Pakistan, I meet many people. One day a close friend from my school days came to see me. 'Help my son to go to Italy,' he begs me. 'It's not a good time,' I tell him. He falls silent. 'What does your son do?' I ask. 'He has a medical testing laboratory. He manages it and is doing well.' I look him in the eyes. 'Let him remain here in Pakistan then. It's much better, believe me. Try to convince your son.' The next day, my friend comes back with tears in his eyes. He tells me that he has conveyed my words to his son, but the boy is desperate and wants to leave at all costs. If he can't leave, he will shoot himself in the head with a pistol. So he helps the boy leave. And years later, he runs into him in Italy. I warned them, the father and the son. I was honest with them. But it was as if I was talking to the deaf. Very well then, so on to Italy. The son arrives. I see him again after 2 years. He is working in the black economy on the fields and is often hungry. He tells me that I was right, that he regrets not having listened to me, that he would have done much better to remain in Pakistan, that this is not the land of opportunity, but it is too late. And I can tell you certainly that amongst the South Asians that I interviewed in Italy, I would say that about 70% of them bitterly regretted having left. So many of the migrants I spoke to had courted extreme danger in making their way to Europe. Some had been shot at while trying to cross borders. Some had almost drowned when their boats capsized in the Mediterranean. One had come close to being run over as he tried to cross into Greece by clinging to the undercarriage of an 18-wheel truck. The element of risk in these journeys is so great that it's not easy to understand why any sane person would jeopardize their lives in this fashion. The only explanation that suggests itself is desperation. The implication is that the migrants have been pushed to such extremes that they have no other options. Desperation, as the scenes following on the recent American withdrawal from Afghanistan have demonstrated yet again, is indeed often the prime factor that compels people to flee from war zones. Some of the catastrophic impacts of global warming, such as droughts, wildfires, and sea level rise, can also leave people no choice but to relocate. Their moves too are effectively driven by desperation. But those explanations can scarcely be applied to the journeys of young men in the prime of their lives who leave relatively peaceful countries like Bangladesh, Senegal, and Morocco. The very fact that they're able to raise the funds required for these journeys indicates that they are not entirely without options. Why then do they expose themselves to life-threatening risks? This was a question I often asked the migrants I met in Italy. Their answers varied, but were also similar in that they made me realize that my question was founded on mistaken assumptions. Risk is not a measurable quantity, but rather a perception that depends on age, material circumstances, and life experience, or the lack of it. Here again, social media and the internet play a very important part. Much of the information that circles back to prospective migrants comes from friends and relatives who have already reached their destinations. In their accounts, the perils of the journey are often downplayed as only rarely posing life-threatening risks, or else those risks are presented as mere obstacles that can be overcome with courage and determination. A boy growing up in a village where many slightly older youths have already departed may draw heart from his friends' accounts of their journeys. But the example of their journeys will also create inducements of other kinds. The pride that older villagers take in their migrant kin and the comforts afforded by remittances from abroad may convince the boy that he would be failing in his own duties to his family if he did not undertake a similar journey in this way. Over time, a culture of migration establishes itself and migration becomes a social norm or even a modern rite of passage in which staying at home is associated with failure and a lack of ambition. In other words, in a village where many others have already left, not to do so for fear of the risks appears as nothing other than cowardice. And in fact, making these journeys has become literally a life cycle ritual, a sort of rite of adulthood. An ordeal which you have to survive in order to prove that you're a man. But such decisions are never made individually. Refugees and migrants almost always travel in cohorts, consisting usually of close friends and relatives. This too creates a sense of security by, as it were, distributing the risks. And the very fact that a machinery of transcontinental movement exists invisibly, like a conveyor belt that starts to move the moment you step on it, is sometimes enough to carry people away, almost independently of their volition. This is something new in the history of human movement. In the words of two specialists on migration, what we are witnessing is not just the story of traditional migrant smuggling on a larger scale. Rather, we are witnessing a paradigm shift. I met several young Bengali and Punjabi boys who had run away from home after quarreling with their families and had almost inadvertently stepped on the conveyor belt and been carried all the way to Italy, hardly knowing where they were. One such journey was that of a 14-year-old Pakistani boy who had fought with his father and run off to the local railway station. In another era, he might have spent a few weeks with relatives in another city before returning to his parents. But this being the time that it is, he had fallen in with a group that was starting a long overland journey across Iran and Turkey to Europe. After surviving many close brushes with death on the borders of Turkey, he ended up in Rome. I also met several ex-farmers from Pakistan whose lands had been swamped by the Jhelum floods of 2014, obviously a climate event. In another era, they might have moved to a town or tried to rebuild their lives after the floods had receded. But such is the present time that they too had decided to set off for Europe instead. To them, that step had not seemed at all drastic, which is a measure of the degree to which these journeys have begun to seem normal even quotidian. It is, of course, not unusual for migrants to develop apprehensions on the road, but very few are able to abort their journeys, usually because they're prevented by their guides and their traffickers, or their cohorts of fellow migrants. But very often, the consideration that keeps them from turning back is simply pride or a sense of honor, or the fear of being regarded as a quitter or a coward. Many of their families will have sold their land at home and invested everything possible in their journey. So if they just go back, the family will have lost everything. So that's the fear that keeps them going. In speaking to migrants, I often had to remind myself that most of them were of an age when it comes almost naturally to court dangers of a certain kind. As for instance, extreme adventurers do when they toboggan down the slopes of active volcanoes or rappel across canyons. Indeed, for a certain kind of person, danger is not a deterrent, but an incentive. Conversely, in some societies, the willingness to brave dangers has long been regarded as a necessary step towards adulthood. These analogies may sound far-fetched or even frivolous in relation to migration. But consider the case of Davide, a Cameroonian who succeeded in migrating to Europe by scaling the heavily armored fences that surround the city of Ceuta on the coast of Morocco. Along with Melilla, Ceuta is one of 2 Spanish enclaves in Africa. Migrants who manage to set foot in either city must by law be treated as though they had stepped on European soil. Both cities are surrounded by trenches and several layers of fences topped with razor wire. They're also guarded by large contingents of Spanish and Moroccan soldiers armed with all the most advanced equipment. Davide, who left Cameroon in September 2013 at age 25, was interviewed in Madrid in 2018 by David Kestenbaum of Chicago Public Radio. In Kestenbaum's words, I quote, Davide describes the whole thing almost as if he were a kid setting out on an adventure. Unlike a lot of people trying to get from Africa to Europe, he said he wasn't persecuted back home. He wasn't starving. He wasn't fleeing violence. He was just curious about the world and excited to see it. Unquote. Davide's journey took him from Cameroon to Algeria, and it was there that he learned that instead of crossing the Mediterranean, he could also reach Europe by climbing the fences that surround Ceuta and Melilla. These are not ordinary fences. They're much, much more frightening than the whatever we put up on the southern border. Just take a look, on the internet. You'll see the razor wire everywhere. 7 layers of razor wire. So Davide traveled to Morocco and joined the large throngs of would-be migrants from all over Africa who camped near the 2 cities and periodically attempt to cross over. So Kestenbaum quotes Davide. In the beginning, says Davide, my opinion was, as you know, I'm a pretty brave guy and I like challenges. I thought I would do it in one try. I had a lot of optimism because that's the type of person I am. I usually do things the first time I try them. Unquote. So Davide's first attempts to cross the fences was encouraging because he managed to get past 1 trench and even reach the 3rd barrier. So he says, I don't know how to express it, but it was something strange. I was thinking, I'm going to do it. Then I thought, I can do it. Then I was doing it. So I said, this is how it's done. I'm doing it. But I don't know how to express it. That's the truth. Here Kestenbaum interjects, does it feel like a crazy sport? Yes, answers Davide. Exactly. That's exactly what it is, the way you put it. It was a weird sport. But Davide's first attempt failed, as did many others. A year went by, and he began to ask himself, why am I doing this? What good is this? I thought about abandoning everything. I would cry. But it was the fence itself that held him there. So he says, it's something more than a fence. I know it may seem silly, but there is something mystical in this fence. I've seen people, when they get in front of the fence, they can't move. There must be a spirit inside the fence that tries to prevent things. It's really something very powerful. It's not just a fence. After 2 years of failed attempts, Davide finally succeeded in crossing over. But his joy did not last long. So he says, when I realized that I had made it, it was like a vacuum. That's the truth. When we're in Morocco, we think whenever I manage to get there, I'm going to be very happy. But once you make it, you don't feel anything. The feeling ends. Davide's experience is a reminder that the idea of the ordeal has always held a certain fascination for human beings. This is why for many migrants, their journeys become the defining moments of their lives. This is in a way the strangest aspect of their plight. In Europe, they're confronted with the political rationality of a certain kind of liberalism that confers its sympathy only on victims. So in dealing with the state, and when talking to activists, they learn to present themselves as victims, as objects without agency, propelled solely by external forces. Yet in their own eyes, as in their eyes of their families back home, they are heroes who have taken their destinies into their hands and endured terrible ordeals. No wonder then that many of them say that the worst part of their journeys consist not of their time on their road or at sea, but rather the months and years they spend languishing in European migrant camps. In those camps, there is nothing to do but wait and sleep. It is little consolation that you are fed and housed and given allowances. It is the waiting and the idleness that break the spirit. Well, I could go on forever, but I'm just going to skip a little bit here. So it needs to be recognized that the forces that are shaping the flow of people today are no different from those that are driving the relentless acceleration in processes of production, consumption, and distribution, also communication. Those who are concerned that mass migration may bring about the breakdown of communities. And I must add here that there are some legitimate reasons for these anxieties in my view. But they must understand that there is a fundamental contradiction between growth and the preservation of community. It's an illusion to imagine that the best way to preserve communities is by excluding other humans. The only way this can be done is by abandoning the prevalent paradigms of perpetual and ever accelerating growth. So the journeys of the migrants of our era represent the appending of a project that began in the 16th century, when European imperial powers launched the most cruel and violent demographic intervention that the world has ever known. In the service of economic expansion, they began to transport people between continents on a gargantuan scale, ultimately changing the demographic profile of the planet. But even as they were and repopulating continents, European colonial governments were careful to preserve the racial and ethnic composition of their own metropolitan territories in Europe. All this was done under rigorous state control, which was exercised through a wide range of technologies, ranging from armaments to the management of information. Today, all the systems that made these massive demographic interventions possible have achieved what we might call escape velocity, in the sense that they are increasingly beyond the control of the state. The flow of people between continents may be only the most visible aspect of the state's diminishing capacities, but it presents Europe with a mirror in which to see the unraveling of some of its most important institutions and projects. It is no coincidence that this great uprooting of people is occurring at the same time that the impacts of climate change are intensifying. The relationship between the two is so close that to ask if contemporary migrations are a consequence of climate change is, I think, to ask the wrong question. Climate change and migration are in fact two cognate aspects of the same thing, in that both are effects of the ever-increasing growth and acceleration of processes of production, consumption, and circulation. In this sense, the dynamic that is driving the other uprootings that we are now witnessing, of trees, animals, plants, glaciers, and so on, is no different from that which is driving the movements of humans. This is another respect in which human history has once again converged with the history of the earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh, for a very thought-provoking talk. In one of the early slides, you showed a table listing the hazardous migration journey from different parts of the world. Bangladesh was near the top. I didn't see India on that list, and yet the conditions and the villages of India and Bangladesh must be quite similar in terms of economic opportunity, access to the internet and social media, and so on. So I was wondering, what is the difference between these two countries in the rate at which people leave the villages? Is it simply the fact that there may be more opportunities in the towns and cities of India compared to Bangladesh, or are there other factors that are involved?
That's a very good question. And actually, I was really struck in all these camps that I went to, there were no Indians. And you do occasionally hear of Punjabi migrants, but their aim is usually to come to North America, not to go to Europe. But it's a very striking thing. I think the reason why, there are two major reasons why this is the case. One is that there are many more opportunities within India. So there's a lot of internal migration going on within India. So if you go to Western India, you'll see now across the coast, all the way from Maharashtra to basically Kerala, the working classes are now entirely from Eastern India. The working classes, they're from Jharkhand, they're from Bengal, they're from Assam, they're from Odisha. They've completely replaced indigenous, people of the coast. There are now schools in Bangalore where the main language spoken is Bengali. So there's been a massive demographic replacement. And what's so interesting about this is that it's not migration on the Western pattern. That is, it's not like those people will go off and actually settle there, although some do, but it's not always like that. Usually it's what we call a circular migration. So, people will go, then after 6 months they'll go back home, they'll replace themselves with a cousin or something, and they'll spend a few months at home, then they'll go back. So they're basically, building up, using the capital to build up a base at home, building a pakka house or whatever. So I think in a way this is perhaps the best, not that there are any good solutions to these problems, but this is one acceptable thing, that they go, from the eastern part of India, which for various reasons lags behind the western part of India. So this becomes a way of redistributing wealth. And of course, one of the main reasons why the western part of India is richer than the eastern part is because they have their own pattern of circular migration. That is, they go to the Gulf and they get money from the Gulf and they, live there, 3, 5, 10 years, and they come back home and build big houses and so on and hire Eastern Indians, to do their work. So that's one major reason, the fact that more opportunities exist within India. The other major reason is that to a very great degree, these patterns of migration are driven by pre-existing networks. So Bangladesh has had, as I said, pre-existing networks going back, to the 19th and indeed 18th centuries. So people travel along these networks. The most important community in India that has these networks, also because of the Indian Army, are Sikhs, and that's why the Sikhs have been moving along these networks for a long time. There are very few other communities that have these networks. The Gujaratis are the main ones, and their patterns of migration are now showing some similar signs. I mean, for example, you have seen that on the Canadian border, absolutely well-off middle-class Gujaratis are freezing to death with their families, because of some desperate fantasy about where they're going. So I think the principal reason why this hasn't started in India on the same scale, though, is that now the networks are coming into being. And once it starts out of India, it's going to be on a really gargantuan scale. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. I spent a good part of my academic career looking at migration on this hemisphere and between here and Europe. And there were so many of the elements that you talked about in terms of the dynamic of migration, motivations, were so similar. And back to Emmanuel Wallerstein's systems theory. But what struck me was the acceleration that you were talking about, the role of social media in the midst of our unawareness, like fish in the water. We are unaware of the impact that our devices and our social media that your description of the mimetic desires is so powerful. Thank you. And I really appreciate that. And it's almost bringing me back 40 years ago when I was doing some of my own research. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, you know, the great theorist of mimesis was, of course, René Girard, and he was a very staunch Catholic. Ah, yes.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So, as I was interested to hear how you believe these dynamics, not only in Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, but you know, broadly around the world, in both the East and the West, how you believe these dynamics will change and evolve through the continued worsening of climate change and all of the disasters and events that will bring about. How do you believe that these dynamics are going to change given what's imminent?
There are many factors to consider there. For example, I mean, it's projected that within the mainland United States itself, by 2050, 55 million people are going to be displaced. By rising sea levels, by heat waves, wildfires, etc. So there's going to be massive internal migration within the United States, and in some respects that's already started. Because people in Florida, for example, are increasingly having difficulty finding insurance for their houses and so on. So that's one aspect of climate-induced migration. But yes, absolutely. I think everywhere else also there are going to be these impacts. People are going to be more and more displaced, and that's already happening. I think in Central America, because we often read that people can no longer practice agriculture in the accustomed ways, so they are being displaced by climate issues already. But I would again want to emphasize that really we should not reduce all these things to climate alone, because it's not just climate change. What we are living through is everything change. There's biodiversity loss, which again impacts heavily upon agriculture. There's species extinctions, and I think the thing we don't talk about, and we should talk about more, is the decline of the soil everywhere around the world. There's massive over-reliance on fossil fuels, basically. And these, in turn, create this fertilizer runoff, so that in the Bay of Bengal now, there's these, and in the Arabian Sea, there are these giant dead zones. Anoxic water, where nothing survives virtually, except things that can breathe sulfur, so devil things. If you think of the number of people who live around the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal, it's estimated that 1 in 4 inhabitants of the planet live in a country that borders the Bay of Bengal. Would you believe that? So you can imagine how profoundly people are going to be affected by this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hello. I'm originally from Miami, Florida, so I guess I'm at like a great crossroads for both environmental change and a lot about migrational culture. The whole city is primarily immigrant in nationality, and luckily most of them speak the same language, Spanish, which I speak some of, so it's a lot easier for me to learn some of that. And I do sort of realize now, sort of informally, the level to which the ordeal plays a role in a lot of this migration. I have a lot of family still in Peru, with some cousins in immensely successful positions that are still considering moving to America just because it's such a big deal to move to America. And I wanted to ask, do you, in what you've seen in more formal research, I guess, areas, does sort of antagonism against migration in Western societies have any sort of strong effect on the numbers migrating, either increasing or decreasing, or is it still relatively the same?
I think antagonism towards migrants may eventually have a great impact. I don't see any signs of it so far, really, even in Europe, which has been dealing with a lot of anti-migrant rhetoric for a long time. The problem for the West, really, is that to a very large degree, the West is the victim of its own propaganda. For years and years they've made out, we are the best, everyone else is underdeveloped, they're poor, they're this, they're that, they're third world, they come from S-hole countries and this and that. And actually, this is the rhetoric. And ultimately people, because of the power of social media, people have come to believe this. So they create these fantasies of what the West actually is, which it in no sense lives up to. Italy can't provide for its own people, far less, masses of migrants. This is true here. You look at what's happening in the Rust Belt or in Appalachia. The US is facing such profound crises, I think the thing that will ultimately decrease migration is when these aspects of what the Western world is facing, when they become better known. And that is one thing that is certainly happening right now. Because of these elections and the rhetoric that surrounds them, I think these aspects of the incredible crises that the West faces are becoming better and better known. The recession in Germany and so on. So I think that's the only way to destroy that fantasy world of the West, as it were.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. My name is Bilal and I'm from Pakistan, and it's interesting how you talked about social media and its role in luring people in to this conveyor belt. And I recently watched a video, I think it was BBC Urdu, where the story was based in a small village in Punjab, where it's maybe like a few hundred or thousand people in it. Most men have these silver plaques of YouTube, which is like, they have like, I don't know, 1 million subscribers, and everyone's making money of it. And in that video, they interviewed a couple of people who returned from the Middle East, coming back into the village and saying we can make more money here. So I wonder if you see a play here for social media to do some of that in reverse, and if you see anything there. But I guess my other question is, and forgive me for asking the second question, is like, how do you see migration as you see it right now differing from a long history of humans always migrating and displacing themselves and putting themselves elsewhere? So how is this different, the era that we live in? Thank you.
Both very good questions. The first one, I'll say that I think social media could play a very important corrective role. Because if you think, for example, of that boy in a Bengal village, he lives in this land, and the only positive pictures he sees are of Western cities and so on. But as villagers in India and across South Asia start putting more and more of their own lives and their own surroundings onto the net, maybe that will change, because they'll see the beauty of what they live in. Most of all, wherever you go, there is no compensation for community, for language, it was just often really heart-wrenching to see these kids living 10 to a room in Palermo, where they try to make a living by throwing, toys in the air and that kind of thing. And it's just absolutely heart-wrenching, because many of them actually have engineering degrees and so on, and they are driven there purely by a sort of fantasy of what their lives might have been like. So I think it's very important that the social media work to create positive images of home. Because let's face it, at the end of the day, this is not good for anyone. It's not good for the villages from which all the men migrate. In Bangladesh now, there are entire districts where whole demographic chunks of the pyramid are just missing. So So that's not good for anyone. The second thing, I think that human beings, as you say, have always moved, but in the past when they moved as communities. That was what really changed under enslavement. Because people were torn out of their communities and sent away so that they had nothing. When they arrived, it was almost impossible to rebuild that sense of community. Again, this was completely a state-controlled project. Slavery was completely state-controlled at every level. And then you had the indenture, which replaced slavery. The indenture was different from slavery in many ways in that people were able to migrate as communities. But again, that's a sort of state-controlled project. What's different today is that the state is no longer in control of these huge movements. And you see this rhetoric more and more throughout the West of how they want to assert control over migration. And I think it will ultimately lead to, how shall I say, a very, very great disruption in these states. We've already seen that with politics, etc. Sorry.
Hi, thank you. How do you foresee the pervasiveness of AI and its effects on both the climate and migration as we're seeing it spread now, and what we know AI can do, both good and bad?
I think it's just going to be another accelerator. It's very easy to see a kid in anywhere in the world saying, "Okay, show me the best route," and AI will show them the best route. Well, thank you all very much. This is
Thank you all so much for coming out. We really appreciate it. Mr. Ghosh will be available to sign books at this table over here. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you.